and divisions, as we know, there is not a single unified, Baha'i tradition. There is a large Haifan group, headquartered in Israel. Then there are, the various Orthodox Baha'i groups all around the world. But this is a loaded claim, and hugely supported and spread by the Baha'is, that make for themselves. They believe that, their religion is probably the youngest worldly religion, and it is a totally unified religion. Quote, the Baha'i faith do not have any sort of branch. Be as it may, we know that there are a couple of other, Baha'i divisions, and Baha'i groups that are very alive, and going on all around the world, in America, in New Zealand, in Australia, such as, probably originating from the discord sparked up between Abdul Baha and his younger brother, Muhammad Ali. Discord that, wound up in establishing, another Baha'i division, all the way to Mason Ramey, Marangala and stuff like that. Could you please tell us about these divisions?
Oh God, we need to do a completely separate podcast just for that. But throughout my podcast, I've already hinted at the fact that there are other groups, that there are other schismatic groups. I've mentioned the Unitarian Baha'is, who are the family of Muhammad Ali, Baha'ullah, etc. These were the people that the schism, the first official schism that happened in the family of Baha'u'llah himself. They are the Unitarian Baha'is. They've sort of made a sort of comeback in the last couple of years, especially during the last decade. Thanks to the efforts of Nama Pirates' Baha'is In My Backyard that interviewed Negar Baha'i Ansel. But there are several different Remiite groups. The main one is the Marangelist Remiite Orthodox Baha'is. We're currently based in Australia, in Perth, and they're on their fourth guardian, who's an Iranian gentleman by the name of, whose name just right now escapes me. His name is.
Mr. Azal, can I name this divisions and probably
there's the Unitarian.
Some explanation.
Sure, hold on. Yeah.
There is the one that I've frequently come across among the writings about the Baha'is is on Baha'ism under the hereditary guardianship.
That's the Marangella group that I was talking about.
So to tell us about this group, because in 1962, Mason Ramey, asked his supporters, in the United States and France, to organize themselves and elect, a National Spiritual Assembly under the hereditary guardianship, short for NSAUHG.
Yeah,
the assembly was incorporated in New Mexico in 1964, and so. Please tell me about that.
Well, like I said, we should leave this for a full podcast because this is such an intricate tale and there's so many different byways. But I'll give a general picture. There is the Baha'is under the hereditary guardianship. This is the group founded by Remy, then succeeded by Joel Marangella. And currently, I just remembered his name. It's under the guardianship of Nusratullah Bahrman. He's an Iranian who lives in Perth, who basically broke from the mainstream Haifan Baha'is and joined the Marangella group, and Marangella named him first as Hand of the Cause, and then elevated him as a successor. Now, since Joel Marangella died, he has become the guardian, the fourth guardian. But there is.
But they've been all declared covenant breakers by the High family.
Whatever that means, you know.
May I interrupt for a second, please?
Yeah.
I think that Wahid is more informed about the people who were, thrown out of the Baha'i faith by Shoghi Effendi as the covenant breakers. Mr. Azal, do you have a list of the people who were declared as covenant breakers by Shoghi Effendi?
Yeah, I do have a list somewhere. It's amongst my couple of hundred or 1,000 pages of notes. Yeah, I have all these lists. He threw out a lot of people and declared them covenant breakers, one of whom was the recently deceased Ehsan Yarshater. Ehsan Yarshater was actually excommunicated. He didn't just lose his voting rights. He was actually excommunicated from the Baha'i faith as a covenant breaker by Shoghi Effendi because he went to the United States. Well, first Britain and then the United States to study. And he did that at the time when Shoghi Effendi had issued the directive forbidding Iranian Baha'is, especially the intellectual class of Iranian Baha'is, from leaving Iran and going overseas. I got the story from his own mouth in 1998 in his own office. And what's very interesting about the case of Ehsan Yarshater is that after the death of Shoghi Effendi, and as Yarshater's own prominence began to rise as a scholar, and particularly when the Iranian government endowed his Encyclopedia Iranica project, the Universal House of Justice and basically the National Spiritual Assemblies of both, or actually all three, the British National Spiritual Assembly, the American National Spiritual Assembly, and the Iranian National Spiritual Assembly basically backed off of Ehsan Yarshater. But he told me that he was actually prevented from attending the funerals of some of his family members the early years when he went back to Iran to visit, and that the attitudes of some of these old Baha'i friends, etc., was deplorable. And then over time, this kind of softened up as the USJ, I guess, and these Baha'i bodies began to back off on their initial excommunication.
And Mr. Azal, it is also believed that he never submit to the teachings of the Baha'is.
No, I asked him about this. He said, look, this was at a period that I'd already left Baha'ism officially. This is one of the reasons he even agreed to meet with me. He said, look, there's some interesting and nice things and nice sounding things in the Baha'i teachings, but, you and I both know that this thing is full of contradictions from top to bottom, and any thinking person, after a very short period of time, just basically comes to this conclusion.
Right. And Mr. Azal, the second one that I want you to explain, the second group is called the Caravan of East and West, headed by Mīrzā Ahmad Sohrab and Mrs. Ruth White. Would you please?
No. That was Julie Chandler. The Caravan group was Ahmad Sohrab and Julie Chandler. Ruth White was a completely different thing altogether. Sohrab was Abdul Baha's secretary. He accompanied Abdul Baha to the United States during his trip, and then I believe he then subsequently stayed on in the United States and became quite a prominent Iranian Baha'i teacher in the United States. Quite a charismatic man, apparently. But once Shoghi Effendi became the guardian of the Baha'i faith, I've read different things about the situation, but for some reason, Sohrab kind of considered Shoghi Effendi a bit of an upstart. And the sentiment was kind of reciprocated on the part of Shoghi Effendi, because this man knew Abdul Baha. He was quite educated. He knew the Baha'i writings much better than even Shoghi Effendi himself. And so there was a clash of personalities, and Shoghi Effendi's probably around from the mid-1920s onwards, the authoritarianism of Shoghi Effendi really began to show itself. And, they began to clash almost, I would say, probably by the period of the early 1930s, the clash between these two began. Shoghi Effendi was obviously very trigger happy with the excommunication, so he excommunicated Sohrab. Sohrab subsequently founded this caravan group with Julie Chandler, and they were quite successful for quite a while. They had a subscription kind of magazines, newsletter subscription that went all around the United States. They basically took the basic Baha'i teachings, but without the label Baha'i, and they were considered like the enlightened liberals of that era. But this was a serious threat to the National Spiritual Assembly of the United States and Canada. At the time, they were a single unified NSA, and so they began to fight Ahmad Sohrab in court. And I think it was in the 1940s, or around that period of time, that Ahmad Sohrab actually won his case in court against the National Spiritual Assembly of the United States and Canada.
And Mr. Azal, I suppose at this time, Mrs. Ruth White simultaneously, questioned the authenticity of Abdullah's
will and testament. Yeah, and she had it forensically tested by experts, one of whom was German, and they all came to the conclusion.
Hans Zimmerman.
Yeah, they all came to the conclusion that this text was a forgery, that this was forged, which is now an open secret, because some of these family members of Shoghi Effendi and Abdul Baha that are still living admit readily that this will and testament of Abdul Baha was actually forged by Shoghi Effendi's own mother.
You are talking about Baha'u'llah himself, Wahid. You're not talking about Abdul Baha.
No, we're talking about Abdul Baha, the will and testament.
No. I mean, the document that was forged was the last will and testament of Baha'u'llah himself.
That was also forged, but this is the will and testament of Abdul Baha. This was forged. The last will and testament of Baha'u'llah, apparently there's also questions around that. There's also a separate document that I mentioned in the last podcast, or one of the podcasts. It's
because
called,
that's the third question I've got for you guys about another division officially called Orthodox Baha'i Faith, headed by Joel Marangella.
That's what I just.
Who was president of Rami's second international Baha'i Court. But before that,
that's the group I mentioned. That's the group I mentioned.
Yes, you mentioned.
There's another group. There's Baha'is under the provisions of the covenant.
Leland Jensen. Tell us about Leland Jensen and this group.
All right. If I may interrupt again, before we go into a different point, I was in Los Angeles a few weeks ago, and somebody who had visited the cemetery of the Baha'is in Haifa or Akka had sent me a picture of the grave of Habibullah Ain al-Mulk, Mr. Hoveyda's father, who is buried in that cemetery. And I would very much like to send that to Wahid, because, the Arabic writings on the grave are of great interest. But what attracted my attention on that tombstone was that there was no, Hu al-Hayy or any Baha'i thing on it. And you also know that Habibullah Ain al-Mulk was also a private secretary to Abdul Baha. Right.
Ain al-Mulk had a falling out with Shoghi Effendi. He was not happy with Shoghi Effendi at all. In fact,
was he excommunicated?
No,
because
I don't
think. Question for you.
Hold on,
Keyvan,
hold on. I don't believe that Ain al-Mulk was excommunicated. I think he had a personal falling out with Shoghi Effendi. There's some contradictory information as to whether Shoghi Effendi actually formally excommunicated him or not. But Ain al-Mulk basically falls into total inactivity as far as Baha'i activities are concerned, from probably around 1922-23 onwards.
So it was a personal falling out with Shoghi Effendi. He was not.
Ain al-Mulk was not impressed with Shoghi Effendi at all. No. At all.
Right. Siab, would you please tell us, before, going back to Wahid, I'd like to ask a question, a personal question. Would you please briefly tell us about these two leading figures, namely Mīrzā Mahmud Kashi, and Mīrzā Reza Qannāt? One of them is apparently, your grandfather.
Right.
Why the Baha'is actually, were based in Haifa, excommunicated them? What happened to them? What grounds they would
I can tell you the historical aspects of those two gentlemen. I'm sure that Wahid knows more about the intricacies of whether they were excommunicated or not, but Mīrzā Mahmud Kashi, who was my mother's grandfather, and Muhammad Qannāt, who was Mr. Hoveyda's grandfather and the father of Habibullah Ain al-Mulk, were brothers-in-law. In other words, my mother and Mr. Amir Abbas Hoveyda were Nave Khales. You see, those two were married to two women from two sisters. And this is where my branch of the family comes in. You see, my grandfather from my mother's side, who was Tarazullah Vadud, and his brother Nusratullah Vadud. And the Hoveyda kids, like Habibullah had two sons, Amir Abbas and Feridun, while his brother, the brother of Ain al-Mulk, Jalil Effendi, had 6, 7 offsprings. I can name them to you one by one. And that is a long history. Now, there is a possibility that the original two, Qannāt and Mīrzā Mahmud Kashi, might have been excommunicated because, they were present at the deathbed of Bahā'u'lláh when he willed that something that we've discussed many, many times. وَمِن بَعْدِ الْغُسْنِ الْأَعْظَمِ وَمِن بَعْدَهُ الْغُسْنِ الْأَكْبَرِ. These are the words of Baha'u'lláh himself.
Yeah.
And many Baha'is do not deny that now. But, they try to spin the story to their own advantage.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, basically, the excommunication of Muhammad Ali was, I'm talking from a legal point of view here, not from any theological point of view, but it was a violation of that will and testament. If a father, if any will and testament makes two children equal successors of an estate, but with one having executive, powers over this estate during a certain period of time, and then another child after a later period of time, arguably from a legal point of view, Abdul Baha had absolutely no power whatsoever to excommunicate Mirza Muhammad Ali. And effectively what this does, in my mind, from a legal perspective, to the Baha'i faith that Baha'u'llah founded, is that it basically delegitimizes itself the very minute this conflict between the two brothers erupted. I have been told by these family members that there's actually two separate will and testament documents. There is a Vasiyat Heykal. This is one that they have apparently in their possession, And then there is the Lohe Vasiyat that most of the Baha'is have. And as you pointed out, there are some questions about the text of the official version of this. In any case, it appears that during the last decade of his life, first of all, Baha'u'llah spent most of his time in Bachi, and with the second wife of his, the mother of Muhammad Ali, Badiullah, Ziaullah, etc. But in this Vasiyat Heykal, which is apparently a quite an explosive document, he seems to prefer this younger son of his, Muhammad Ali, to Abbas Effendi. Now, we can sit here and speculate as to why that was the case, but I have read that Baha'u'llah seemed to have a big conflict with the wife of Abdul Baha. He didn't like this woman for some reason. And towards the final years of his life, we see these very contradictory statements by him. There was also one loh that I translated, actually, and it was also on bionic.com. It's called "All Creator of All Creation," where, he's just, the man is completely rambling senile in this tablet. But you look at this, you read this, and you see that the issue of the succession, at least the way it should have been, is that Baha'u'llah conceived a sort of looser, less centralized kind of succession where his children would occupy collectively a kind of a exalted status in this Baha'i community that he'd formulated, with Abbas Effendi as the kind of the head of the community during his own lifetime, to then be succeeded by the other son. But nothing like the kind of organization and the kind of Baha'i faith that Abbas Effendi immediately began to construct after his father's death.
So that's my question, Wahid, because Wahid, I've got a question. Why did Abdul Baha in the first place, decide to undermine, his younger brother,
power,
and leave him with a ramshackle, situation?
It's clear as day. Muhammad Ali would have been a permanent threat to Abbas Effendi if he had not excommunicated him and his family. Over money, over power, the pilgrims that were coming from overseas. Immediately Abbas Effendi jumped on these British and American pilgrims that were interested in what the message of this Baha'ism was.
And the contributions,
the monies, etc. Muhammad Ali, from what I've read, even of his own writings and what I've then heard about it, had a temperament much closer, interestingly enough, to Sohrab Azal. He was a very quiet, soft-spoken kind of person, contemplative.
That's interesting.
Contemplative kind of person, whereas Abbas Effendi was more like Baha'u'llah himself.
I see.
He was extremely ambitious and, an organizer, a networker, and a politician, of mind-boggling Machiavellian proportions. So, in a sense, once Abdul Baha got into gear, Mīrzā Muhammad Ali didn't stand a chance against this older stepbrother of his. But, when you read these documents, and especially some of these documents that these hyphens have decided they're never going to make public, this what ensued after the death of Baha'u'llah was definitely not what he wanted to happen, between his children.
And there is another classic within entitled.
Hold on a second. Let me throw. Hold on, Keyvan. Let me throw this point in here. It occurs to me that the way that Baha'u'llah conceived this whole issue of succession, right, stems from a guilty conscience on his part as to what he did to Sohrab Azal. Because when you read the wording, even of this Kitab Vasiyat of his, of this Lohe Vasiyat of his will and testament, he is trying to have his cake and eat it too. By appointing the two sons one after another, not imbuing either of these sons with total, unquestionable infallibility. Okay, now the Baha'is will argue otherwise, but when you read this in the original, you see that he was trying to, kind of level out the playing field between these two boys. And then when you read some of these other documents around it, that becomes quite evident. So, what happens in this family upon the death of Baha'u'llah, it was basically the same story as to what Baha'u'llah had done to Sohrab Azal, except this time Abdul Baha is in is in the driver's seat as his father, with his younger brother Mīrzā Muhammad Ali playing the role of Sohrab Azal.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting.
And Wahid,
Keyvan, I have to rush and go to work. I have different times than you guys in Europe. Now, one last question that I have for Wahid. Are the tablets or Lawh-e Baha'ullah documented in a chronological order?
Not that I'm aware of. They this is the problem. No one is allowed into these archives that the hyphens have on Mount Carmel. Now, the families have their own collection, and some of these are beginning to kind of slowly trickle out. I've got a couple. A few of them have been scanned here and there. But this guy wrote a lot of stuff, and the vast majority of these are held by the hyphens themselves, and they will not allow anybody to look at any of these documents.
Now, the reason I'm asking this, I have no documentation proof of what I'm telling you guys, but my father always claimed that he got his name from Baha'u'llah himself, and used to tell us that story off and on. He said, when my father was born, my grandfather, who lived in Bentage Bay, Lebanon at the time, took my father to Akka, where Baha'u'llah was, as, the greater Iranian authority in the region. That was the habit at the times, where the Kat Khuda or somebody would give the name to newborn males in every family. The story that my father used to tell is that his father took him on a back of a donkey from Bentage Bay to Akka, where he met Baha'u'llah, and Baha'u'llah took a look at my father, and he was a beautiful child. And he said, وَسَمَّيْنَاهُ بِالْجَمِيلِ. That was my father's name. And always my father claimed that his father gave Baha'u'llah a coin of 5 asmaliye at the time, 5 Ottoman sovereigns to Baha'u'llah to get that name. This is why, I'm just trying to see whether...
Speaking of your father, could you please officially declare that and confirm, that your father had never been a Baha'i?
Not my father, not his father. My grandfather, Muhammad Ali Zand, who left Iran more or less around the same time as the Baha'i group under Hassan Ali Nouri, took a different route. He went through Turkey, Lebanon, and then he settled in the south of Lebanon in a village called Bentage Bay, while, Hassan Ali Nouri and his followers took the route through Kurdistan, Iraq, then to Turkey, and they were banished to Haifa and Cyprus at the time. No, Mr. Amir Abbas Hoveyda was never a Baha'i. I have met him on numerous occasions. He was, he didn't believe in religion whatsoever. He was educated in Europe, and he was what we would, Iranians call him as a laik. Amir Abbas Hoveyda was not...
So is the case with Feridun?
Feridun too. Feridun married a German girl, and she is still alive. He's got 2 daughters from that girl. I just found out about that during my last trip to Los Angeles a few weeks ago.
But Abbas was a Freemason, was he not?
Freemasons, this was the thing in Iran at the time. like Sharif Imami was the grand
master of the lodge,
one of the loges and things. And I know of the cousins of Amir Abbas being members of Freemasons. Whether he was or not, I suspect that he was, yes.
I mean, that's part of his biography. Abbas Milani also mentioned it in the version.
You know, being a Freemason at the time in Iran was a position of power, you know, since most of the Rijal in Iran were Freemasons.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, and it's not, you know, we shouldn't read into the ideas and beliefs of Freemasons as far as the Iranian were concerned. They were not very strong believers in the principles of the Freemasonry, but they became members of the different lodges just, you know, to show that wujud dashan. That's all there is to it.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay. And my final question, who is Jacques Soromyan?
Jacques Soromyan is one of the pretenders to the guardianship. He's a rival of the current guardian, Nusratullah Bahraman. Last I heard, he had actually moved to Australia, funnily enough. He was in Europe for a very long time, in either Monte Carlo or somewhere around that area of the south of France. And then all of a sudden I heard that one of his deputies was in the west coast of Australia. So you have two rival guardians on each side of the Australian continent, and the NSA of Australia, which is shrinking in its enrollments by the day.
So you said Soromyan died in 2013 and passed the successorship to Yazdani, Mr. Yazdani.
Yes, Mr. Yazdani, that's correct. Yep. And he's
in
Australia.
Mr. Azal, what's your take on these other non-Hi-Fi Baha'is, you know, overall?
Well, there doesn't seem to be much of them around. I mean, the Marangelis, I've interacted with these people a little bit. They're generally okay people, I would say. They are also closed-minded in very similar ways as the hyphens are, but they're not as malevolent as the hyphens are. You know, I mean, they went to court with these guys back in 2007 and 8 because the National Spiritual Assembly of the United States sued them for copyright infringement. I don't know if you followed that case, but they lost in a U.S. district court in Illinois, and then lost the appeal as well. You can find the transcripts and actually the appellate hearing as well, which is quite a interesting listen, where these judges just grill these US NSA lawyers for a good 20, 30, 40 minutes. They're okay people. The Jensenites, the Baha'is under the provision of the covenant, these people are weird, just weird, in my opinion. I've interacted a little bit with these folks. They're mainly Americans. You know, you will not find them dispersed outside of the United States, and their current head has some kind of claim to the throne of Israel, you know, of being the legitimate, having the lineage of David, etc. So he has monarchical aspirations for the throne of Israel. Here in Germany, there apparently are some Frei Baha'is, you know, the free Baha'is. These are people that broke here in Europe with Shoghi Effendi pretty early on in the late 1920s. I've not run into any of these people, but I know that, you know, I've been told that they still exist in very small enclaves. You know, if the hyphens are disappearing, you know, you can only imagine what these other groups, you know, how they are disappearing. As
Gentlemen, I do have to beg your pardon and ask to be excused, but before I go, I have one question to Wahid. Who is the president of the International House of Justice now?
There is none.
There is none?
No.
So what, they're doing it as a group together?
Well, theoretically, yeah.
And sorry, my final question for you before you're leaving us and finally leaving this podcast. Could you please very briefly point out the grounds, on which Abbas Effendi, was bestowed upon with the title of knighthood, sir, by the British government?
Keyvan, all right. Wahid also knows this. This is a discussion that would take over an hour.
We should do this in February.
Yeah,
Keyvan.
exactly.
Yeah.
To bring all our research and documentation to that effect into to the attention of who may be interested. But there is no doubt whatsoever that Abdul Baha or Abbas Effendi was an official agent of British intelligence. I can tell you stories about what he did and the justifications for what I'm saying. We will leave that to a longer discussion, and I will be more than glad to participate in such a discussion at a later date.
Very good.
All right. So, gentlemen,
thank you very much for you guys, for participating in this podcast. Let's take this podcast as a postscript and I wish you both, best of luck. Thank you very much.
Good night to you in Europe, and good night to Wahid in Europe too.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.